In today's game, we see Bobby Fischer facing off against Miguel Najdorf from Argentina, the legendary Grand Master. And what opening does Najdorf play? Well, his own namesake opening, the Najdorf defense of the Sicilian. Now, Miguel Najdorf did not invent the opening, but he played it well enough and early enough to put his Grand Master's stamp on it. And now it is his name that is attached to one of the greatest openings in chess. Again, the opening that Bobby Fischer played almost exclusively against e4, but now he is facing Najdorf. This was in the Olympiad in 1962, the United States versus Argentina. Fischer has white. Let us jump right in. He begins with e4. Najdorf plays c5, knight f3, d6, d4, the open Sicilian. After knight f6, knight c3, a6, we have the Najdorf Sicilian on the board. The idea of a6 is to keep a piece out of b5, because black would maybe like to kick this d4 knight with e5, and he doesn't want it to land on the b5 square. But also, he can gain some space on the queen side with b5 himself. The downside, of course, is that he's not moving a piece. He's moving a pawn, so sometimes white can get some very quick attacks in the Najdorf. Now here, Bobby plays a move that's very popular these days. It's very trendy. And that's the move h3. And this is just like the Najdorf. The intention is twofold. One, to keep a piece out of g4, but then also perhaps to expand with g4 on the king side. So he matches cunning with cunning here, playing a move similar to the one Najdorf has just played. Now, Bobby usually like to play the bishop to c4, the Sozin system, and that will have some importance in the game as we go forward. h3, though, was played in the game. Now b5 from Najdorf, gaining space on the queen side. Perhaps e5 or e6 was more stable. And Fischer jumps right in with knight to d5. He does not waste time. He's threatening to take the black knight at f6 and damage black's pawn structure. If black takes on d5 after ed5, white has a pretty good position. There's this weak c6 square. He can generate pressure down the e-file. White is doing very well. As it turns out, the best move for black was probably to just bite the bullet and grab the pawn on e4 after, say, something like queen to e2, knight c5, g3. The position is theoretically equal, but this is dangerous for black. I can understand why someone would not want to go into a position like this against Fischer, even if modern computers see this as an equal position. So Najdorf instead plays the move bishop to b7, putting pressure on this diagonal and on the knight and pawn. But then Fischer carries out his goal with knight to d5. He takes the knight at f6, and after gf6, he has done some damage to black's pawn structure. Although this type of pawn structure is very common in a classical Sicilian, black does have to ask the question, what am I going to do with my king? And can Fischer exploit that? Now, his next move is quite strong. He plays the move c4. And what he's doing, of course, is challenging Najdorf's space on the queen side. But more importantly, he wants his bishop to recapture the pawn and become active on the c4 square. We already know he likes his bishop at c4 in these positions, so now he can get it on c4 later in the game. Now, maybe a move like e5, knight e2, f5 was an interesting idea that black could have played. Also, he could have just grabbed the pawn at e4 here, and after c takes b5, then play e5, knight e2, d5. This is all very sharp, and black still has to worry about his king in the middle of the board, but those are probably better moves than the one he played in the game. He did, in fact, go ahead and take that pawn, and Fischer retakes with his bishop, and Fischer has his bishop exactly where he wants it, on that Sozin square, aiming directly at the f7 pawn of black. And that pressure will be there for quite some time as the game continues. Now here, Najdorf plays bishop takes e4. Now this is risky, but it's also practical. It's clear Fischer has well-developed pieces and potential for an attack, so I think Najdorf was reasoning, well, at least I'm going to get some material. Then if I can successfully defend, I'll have this extra material to work with. Also, I can give a pawn back in my defense, in the defense of my king, and then I won't be down a pawn because I've already gained one. A safer move is like queen to c7, but here Fischer has what he wants, and he can just slowly work on the black position. So Najdorf goes ahead and takes that central pawn at e4. Fischer goes ahead and castles. Now d5 from black. The safe move from Fischer would have been to just retreat his bishop, but he plays the sharper rook to e1. But this does give Najdorf a chance to get back in the game. He could have played the move bishop takes g2 here and grab that g pawn, and after king takes g2, black can go ahead and take the bishop at c4. Black's up a couple of pawns, but white's king is in a little bit of danger. This is probably an equal position, but very tricky, obviously, for both sides. But instead, Najdorf played the move e5. Now, Fischer has two pieces en prise, the bishop and the knight, but black has to worry about his king. Here, Fischer could play the bishop to b3. Then if pawn takes knight, he has some very powerful attacking ideas. Of course, he could just play the safe f3, regaining the bishop because of the pin, but even more aggressive is queen to h5, hitting this d5 pawn, which is under-defended because this bishop is pinned. And if the pawn is not there, he's got to worry about threats against f7. So, for example, if bishop to e7, to stop the pin down the e-file, he can still take the bishop, because after pawn takes, queen takes f7 check, king d7, then after bishop to f4, we can see black's king is in huge trouble, and Fischer has a decisive attack in this position. But instead, Fischer plays the move queen to a4 check. If Najdorf blocks with the queen, then bishop to b5 pins the queen. Now, obviously, black can take that bishop, but then Fischer would get the rook, and after, say, bishop to d6 to defend the knight, just rook takes e4, pawn takes, queen takes e4, and the knight can go into f5, and white has a very, very strong position here. So instead, Najdorf blocks with his knight instead, but then Fischer's able to play this powerful idea, rook to e4, rook takes e4, creating a really amazing structure in the middle of the board where Fischer has three pieces en prise. The bishop, the knight, and the rook can all be captured. But as Tall used to say, they can only capture one piece at a time. And here, black can only capture one of these pieces. The two will remain for the next move. He decides to go ahead and take the most valuable of those three pieces. Najdorf captures the rook on e4. Then Fischer jumps in with his knight to f5. Now, the material balance, black has a rook and a pawn in exchange for a bishop. That's about a piece's worth of material. So black has a nice material advantage, but white is much better because of the incredible activity of Fischer's pieces and Najdorf's king still stranded in the middle of the board. Najdorf plays bishop to c5, placing the bishop on an active square. Knight to g7 check from Fischer. Now, basically what he's doing is he's forcing the king to move so that black loses castling privileges. If he plays the king to f8, then just bishop to h6, threatening a discovery. And if the king moves to e7, knight f5 check, king e8, bishop to e3, this is the same position as we have in the game. So Najdorf just plays king to e7 immediately, then knight to f5 check, king to e8, and bishop to e3. So it's the same position, just a different move order. And the king is on the same square. It's exactly where it was, except now it's illegal for him to castle because the king has moved. That was the idea behind Fischer's knight g7 check maneuver. Now bishop takes bishop, changing off the one piece in black's position that was fairly well developed. He goes ahead and takes with the pawn. He wants to leave the knight on this beautiful f5 square, and maybe the rook could even find some activity on the f-file. Queen to b6, hitting the b2 pawn and putting some pressure on this b6 g1 diagonal, aiming at Fischer's king. But rook to d1 from Fischer, threatening queen takes knight check, which would lead, of course, to a quick mate. So Najdorf defends that knight laterally with his rook, but now rook to d6 from Bobby Fischer. Obviously, this rook is defended by the knight. It hits the queen. It hits the pawn at f6. Now, if black were to get greedy and take on b2, then Fischer could play bishop takes f7 check, and if king takes f7, rook takes. A potential line after rook takes, queen takes is this quick mating pattern. Queen to g7 check, king takes knight, queen to g4 would be checkmate. And if black plays, say, queen to c7, then Fischer could just take on f6. The knight cannot capture the rook, and Fischer is attacking f7 twice with the rook and the bishop. That would be no good. So Najdorf plays the queen back to d8. Now he's covering the f6 square, but Fischer plays queen to b3. Notice we talked about the pressure on this f7 square from this bishop at c4. That pressure is still very much there. It's even only grown in intensity as the game has gone on. If Najdorf were to try to defend f7 with his rook, the knight to g7 check, king to e7, and then Fischer would play queen to b4, setting up a devastating discovery from the rook, and there's nothing black can do to stop that discovery from coming. It's just going to be big trouble. So instead, Najdorf plays queen to c7, at the very least, giving his king a place to shift over to d8 to survive. Now bishop takes f7 check, king to d8, and here bishop to e6. And in this position, up and exchange, Najdorf resigned. Let's take a little look at this to see why. Because, I mean, at the moment, this knight, while pinned and attacked, is also defended 3 times by the rook, the queen, and the king. Well, at the moment, of course, Fischer's threatening to take it with the rook, which would win the queen, because it would be a check of the king and attacking the queen. So let's say Najdorf moved his queen out of the way, right? That way he's still defending, but the queen would not have to recapture. Then queen to b6 check. Remember, this knight can't take the queen because it's pinned by the rook. This is a check of the king and an attack of the rook on a7, so rook to c7 would basically be forced. But then all Fischer would have to do is just retreat the rook to d1, and the threat of queen to d6, queen to e7 mate essentially would be decisive. There would be too many threats, and there would be nothing Najdorf could do to stop it. So because of that, after bishop to e6, seeing all these threats, Miguel Najdorf resigned. A brilliant win from Fischer, and I love that position with 3 pieces hanging right in the middle of the board. A brilliant chess. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.